Hi, I'm Jessica, and I'm really excited to share with you today out of the series that we've been doing in the Gospel of Luke, looking at all of the different times that Jesus was at tables enjoying meals with people, or speaking about meals at tables. And so our passage today comes from Luke chapter 14. And in this part, Jesus tells a story, and it's part allegory about Jesus' mission to the world. And it's partly instruction on how we participate in his mission through the practice of hospitality. And knowing a few different little cultural things in the background can help us to understand this story a whole lot better. And so first I want to mention that the host would have been a wealthy person throwing this party, wealthy enough to throw a party and wealthy enough to send out a servant to come. And secondly, the way that invitations worked in the ancient world is a little bit different from how we do evites and maybe responses today. At that point in time, if a person was hosting a party, they would have sent out a formal invitation really far in advance. And when they would have gotten back all of their RSVPs, their yes responses, they would wait for the day of the party. And then when that day came, once all of the food was prepared and the tables were set, imagine they didn't have modern cooking devices, so it wasn't quite the same science it is today. When the table was ready and the meal was prepared, the servant was sent back out to the people who had responded yes to come to the party, and they were told now is the time to come, and they would have come at that time. Now, what happens in this story is that when the servant goes out to invite the people who had already said yes, he actually ended up getting 3 no's in the end. And that would have been really, 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 really poor form in those days. Like the manners police would have been after these people. Because after saying yes, it would have been really rude to the host, a total faux pas, to then retract the yes and not attend the party. And so that gives us a little bit of an understanding of what's going on here. Now, the first 2 people had pretty terrible excuses, to be honest. One said they had just bought some land and so they couldn't come. The other said they had just bought some oxen so they couldn't come. They had to go see how the oxen worked out and what the land looked like. But the truth of the matter is, nobody would have bought the land without seeing it first, and nobody would have bought the oxen without seeing how well they worked. So the excuse that they gave was really an equivalent to, I'm washing my hair. The third person had a slightly better excuse, saying that he just got married, but the likelihood that he would have not known he was getting married between the time the invitation went out and when he gave his no was pretty small. So we might give him like a C+ for his excuse. The first 2 totally got an F. They failed. Bad excuses. And so it's really interesting in here what happens when those excuses come back and the host finds out that his invited guests have actually declined his invitation in the end. He becomes angry, and then he sends his servant back out. And instead of going to wealthy people who were able to buy land and buy oxen, this time they are sent to go find people in the city, in the streets. He said, invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame to this meal. And when those people had come and filled in the table, there was still some room. And so the host sent the servant back out for a 3rd time. And this time he said, go out into the country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. And there's 2 layers of interpretation for what's going on in this story. The first one is a little bit more obvious, and that is that when we host a party, we are meant to invite the disenfranchised and people who have no way of really reciprocating our invitation. That's the more obvious layer of interpretation. But second layer of interpretation actually frames the big picture of what's going on here. The first round of invitations were representative of the people of Israel. And those were the ones who were God's chosen people. They were invited to the party originally. They were the original guest. But when Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets, many of the people of Israel did not recognize him, and they tragically refused his invitation. And then the second round of invitation, the townspeople, those really represent the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. Those were Jesus's friends. They were the sinners, the tax collectors, the people of ill repute that he hung out around. And then the third round of invitations, where the servant was sent outside of the city gates, that represents the Gentiles. And those were the people outside the nation of Israel. And so the underlying theme here is that the gospel is for absolutely everybody. And we're also meant to understand here that we demonstrate hospitality toward people because God demonstrates hospitality toward us. And we see this all throughout the biblical narrative. We see it in the beginning, in the garden. God is actually the host there of Adam and Eve. He provides for them a place to live, and he provides for them food to eat. And then we see it again during the exile of Israel. God provides manna and quail to the people when they are out wandering in the wilderness. He is their host. And then lastly, we see it that hospitality is embedded in the gospel message. God is the host, and he sends Jesus to invite us and to enable us to enter into relationship with him. And this functions much like the servant who was sent out to invite the guests to the table. That is what Jesus has done for us. He has made a way for us to come and to dine with God. And every time we welcome people into our homes and into our lives, we're actually reenacting the gospel message. Because Jesus had that connection with the Father, that welcomed with the Father, he extended that to us so that we could enter in to God's presence. Jesus lived in perfect relationship with the Father, and his righteousness was extended to cover us. The underlying message of all of this is that truly the gospel is for everyone. And we participate in the advancement of the gospel when we share our tables and when we share our lives with other people. Jesus tells this story here in Luke 14 to really expose our motivations and how we practice hospitality. Because if unchecked, if we're totally honest, most of our hospitality is self-centered and self-serving. And Jesus is making a huge critique of that here. Generally speaking, we invite people and we host people because we want to be celebrated. We want to be seen for better than we are. But the church has always had a really deep understanding of the truest sense of a biblical layer and level of hospitality. And the church has always understood hospitality as being central to their faithfulness. We see this throughout Scripture. In 1 Timothy, we see hospitality listed as a qualification for eldership. So right there on the list with all these other things like being faithful in marriage, not being a drunkard, not being quarrelsome, the ability to teach, and freedom for the love of money, we see must be hospitable right there on the list of qualifications to lead within the life of the church. Hebrews 13 tells us that it's possible to actually entertain angels without knowing it when we entertain strangers. And then Matthew 25, this one really, taken together with Luke 14, helped the church to understand hospitality as central in how they demonstrate the gospel. It's a really intense passage about the final judgment, and Jesus describes it by saying that whatever we do for the least of people, whatever hospitality we show to the least, the last, and the lost, is hospitality that we actually offer to Jesus himself. And that whatever we refuse to do for the least, for the last, for the lost, is hospitality that we refuse to offer to Jesus. So these passages really convinced the church early on that it is absolutely necessary and not optional to be people who practice hospitality in and with our very lives. And hospitality, it really reveals the conditions of our hearts. We found out really quickly if we're wrapped up in the kingdom or if we are wrapped up in ourselves by the way that we practice hospitality. And hospitality is not always easy, and it's not always natural. 1 Peter 4:9 says to offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. This passage seems to indicate that some people would offer hospitality with grumbling, which means a begrudging sense of hospitality, which isn't really a true hospitality, not a Christian hospitality, not a biblical hospitality. Hospitality that is offered without a pure heart, or hospitality that's offered with strings attached, is not the purest form of hospitality, and it's not the kind of hospitality that Jesus invites us to practice. We tend to behave selfishly when we practice our hospitality. It's just in our human nature. We have to fight it. We tend to be more self-interested in our hospitality rather than kingdom interested. And here is how those things sort of play out in our everyday lives. A self-interested version of hospitality is super transactional. It's a lot like the hospitality industry. We think of hotels and restaurants as industries that thrive in hospitality, meaning when we go to them, that they will provide to us really nice meals, really nice places to sleep and stay. But it's totally done out of a motivation for the transaction. They don't do it because they're nice. Restaurants don't just out of the kindness of their hearts let us come in and eat. They provide us those meals, and hotels provide us a place to stay because we offer them money in return. There's a transaction there. And that's kind of the opposite in Christian hospitality. We don't give to get. We give for the sake of the kingdom. And honestly, we're motivated when we do Christian hospitality because we have been welcomed by God. And so we want to welcome other people. It's very, very different from this transactional way of doing hospitality. In the ancient world, the story that we read earlier, the host would have really taken on a lot of shame on himself and on his family for inviting people of a lower class into his home to share a meal with him. But in Christian hospitality, we believe it's flipped upside down. It is the upside down kingdom. We believe that when we invite people who have no way of reciprocating, who cannot repay us for what we give, that the kingdom actually comes in those moments. And the scripture even tells us that we'll be rewarded for that in the end, that when we offer hospitality to those who cannot repay it, that is the purest and the cleanest form of hospitality that we can offer. A self-interested version of hospitality is purely just a job. It is a transaction. It is tit for tat. It's keeping score. It's not going above or beyond or overboard. It's doing what is required. But a Christian version of hospitality, a pure and a true form of Christian hospitality, offers hospitality as a lifestyle. And it's never done, and there's always more to do. It's always incomplete, and it's really often imperfect. So there's a real contrast there between how the world practices hospitality for a self-gain and how Christians practice hospitality for kingdom advancement. I hope by now that we're all really convinced that hospitality is totally necessary in the Christian life. But I want to talk about what it really actually practically looks like. How do we get started on this? What do we do when we demonstrate hospitality in our everyday lives? I fortunately grew up in a family that my mom and dad were really wonderful in the way that they practice hospitality. And I can remember growing up overhearing my parents starting to have conversations, especially when holidays were coming up, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, even July 4th, just times that we typically would gather with friends or with family or have people around. And mom and dad would often talk about who would be alone today if we didn't invite them. I remember them reaching out often to people who had recently lost spouses through divorce or through death, been widowed. They would reach out to single parents who would have been having to prepare and host all alone on those days. And my mom and dad really did a wonderful job of making sure that no one was left alone at the moments when it was natural to gather. And I have to say, as a single adult now, I'm actually so grateful for the way that they did that, because for me, it really normalized having friends as family, the family-like community that we talk about at Arise. That was something that my family really did. We would look for people who were without. And so I'm so grateful for the mom and dad who set that example and made it normative for me. But starting a lifestyle of everyday hospitality can be a little bit intimidating, especially if we're not confident in our hosting skills or if our motivations for doing hosting are not entirely pure. And so, or even if they're just a little bit mixed motives. So deep down, most of our hosting is rooted, like I mentioned, in selfishness. We tend to invite people that we want to impress, and then we actually try to appear impressive once we have invited them. We want people to admire our cooking, our beautiful, sparkling, clean houses, and we want them to actually think better of us after the evening. And while our hospitality is not really like blatantly transactional, as in we don't charge a fee per plate for our guest, it is tempting to seek to be paid in admiration, in compliments, and in reciprocal invitations, and just the hope that we'll be invited to other places and other spaces because we have invited. But when we plan to invite people to our tables, we spend a lot of energy thinking about the menu. We spend a lot of energy thinking about grocery shopping, about cleaning the house, and about setting the table. And sadly, that approach that we often take is a lot more Martha and a lot less Mary in how we serve our guests. But I wonder what would happen if we spent more time thinking about the quality of the conversation that we want to have. We want to think about the guests that we could invite who might never be able to repay us. And what would happen if we spent more energy and thought a lot more about how to create the kind of atmosphere where people could come and feel welcome and bring their lives as they are and interact with us in our lives as they really are, not the cleaned up versions. When I was in college, during my freshman year on Thanksgiving break, I called my mom to ask her if I could invite a friend that I had made who was from Alaska. And my mom, as I mentioned earlier, loves taking in people who would otherwise be alone on a holiday. And so, of course, she said yes. And so I brought this friend home for Thanksgiving. And I noticed that right before Mom left to go to the grocery store to do the big shop where all the people are at Kroger right before Thanksgiving, that she asked my friend a question. She said, "Is there anything that you want to add to the menu that you would normally have with your family that we could have that would remind you of home?" And she also asked, what does your family normally do for Thanksgiving? And it was really amazing to me that I realized that my friend immediately had so much to share. And I was sort of shocked at how much it was really evident to me, even as her friend at 18 years old, to realize how much she needed to say it. She needed someone to hear her story of what it was like to grow up with 6 sisters in Alaska. And she needed to talk about what her family was like, what the traditions were like in her home. She just really needed to be seen and needed to be heard. And I really didn't know that, even though she had been my friend and I brought her home. But something about my mother offering that hospitality and opening that door cracked open a need that she had. And I was surprised at the way that we were able to meet it just by being present with her. And I wonder how many moments like these and countless other ones like them we miss by not just practicing hospitality, by not just asking the questions and opening the doors and being more present to people and less present to the details and the worry of the menu and all the logistics of hosting. Because we think of hosting as managing burdensome logistics rather than holding space for welcoming people, we often put it off, or even worse, never even get started at the practice of hospitality. We have to be willing for people to see us as we really are, in our lived-in homes that are never quite as perfectly tidy as we would like for people to think that they are. Sharing lives means sharing messes. And the evidence of the daily grind will live all over our houses. In real life, our houses are filled with clutter and stacked up mail and the evidence of coffee stains from this morning and the evidence of children and their art projects and spouses and whatever they're working on. This is what our houses really look like in real life. And so to share our lives with each other means to really share our homes and our menus and ourselves as we really are. It turns out that the to-do list that is meant to help us to prepare to have guests actually mostly ends up preventing us from having guests. Michael Lynn Smith really gets after this in a quote. She's an author, blogger, speaker, professional decorator, and she says this: "We like to tell ourselves that we are insisting on perfection for the betterment of those around us. But really, insisting on perfection is a self-centered act. When we insist that we are perfect, that our homes are perfect, that our families present us perfect, we are not actually thinking about our guests. We are so engrossed and enveloped in our own desire to put our best foot forward. It's actually deeply selfish to withhold our lives from other people until we can put forth a more curated, perfect version. So that's a pretty harsh thing to think about, and it's a heavy load to live with, but it's actually pretty freeing at the same time. We don't actually have to wait until the perfect time comes, when the house is picked up, when there's wide open spaces in the menu to take 3 days to cook and plan and make something gourmet. We can actually just open up our lives as they really are and invite our friends and invite our neighbors and invite those who are near and far into our lives as we actually exist and as we actually live. And here at Arise Church, we really don't have a ton of programs to attend as much as we want to just invite you into a lifestyle. We really do believe that the life of the church is in the life of the people, that the way that you do meals in your home is actually an expression of how we desire to build the kingdom, because these are the ways that Jesus talks about building the kingdom. And so today, Arise Church, I'm proposing that we push back against this false way of doing hospitality and to step forward in some really new and raw ways of doing life together. I want to think about our connections across the church and across the city and how they could be totally different a year from now if we will just embrace this messy way of doing life together and sharing meals in the ordinary. In pursuit of learning how to actually do this gritty way of life together, I discovered some terminology that I'm totally going to steal and add to my vocabulary, and I'm excited about sharing some of it with you today. Father Jack King is an Anglican priest in Knoxville, Tennessee, and it is a city that is on the Tennessee River, and they were hosting the World's Fair in 1981, and there was an article written in the New York Times where Knoxville was referred to as a scruffy little city on the Tennessee River. And that would have been a pretty offensive thing to read, but instead of taking that as an insult, the city of Knoxville really took it up as a badge of honor and as something that they wanted to celebrate about themselves, that they were a scruffy people. And so they just thrived in their scruffiness, and it became a big part of how they identified themselves. And as a priest serving in that area, Jack King talks about scruffy hospitality, and it's actually super helpful language. So this is how he describes scruffy hospitality. Scruffy hospitality means you're not waiting for everything in your house to be in order before you host and serve friends in your home. Scruffy hospitality means you hunger more for good conversation and serving a simple meal of what you have, not what you don't have. Scruffy hospitality means you're more interested in quality conversation than the impression your home or lawn makes. If we only serve meals with friends when we're excellent, we aren't truly sharing life together. It's such a challenge to take up scruffy hospitality when the pressures would say to do something Instagram worthy, to do something beautiful, to do something over the top, to do something opulent. But the truth is that's not how most of us live day to day. And it's totally fine on occasions that we want to celebrate, to do meals that are more gourmet, or to take time with them, or to clean up and polish. But the truth is, our day-to-day, everyday lives are not really like that. And if we're waiting until the moments when we have everything together to open our doors, we're going to miss a kingdom opportunity after kingdom opportunity, day after day and year after year. We'll find that days and weeks get past us when we kept thinking, oh, I need to invite so-and-so over. I need to break bread with them. I need to share a meal. And we will miss all the life that could have happened because we were waiting for a better backdrop. And I found a similar article by a successful fiction author named Kelly Powell, and love the title of it. These are her rules for hosting a crappy dinner party and seeing your friends more often. That's the name of the article. And the 3 rules that she shares that I find most helpful are these. Rule number 1, no housework is to be done prior to your guest's arrival. Number 2, the menu must be simple and not involve a special trip to the grocery store. And rule number 3, you must wear whatever you happen to have on already. These things are not natural. We want to put our best foot forward. But if we will embrace life with doing scruffy and crappy meals together, I think we'll actually find that we share a lot more life. Christine Pohl is a scholar who is right here in the area at Asbury Seminary, and she has devoted her entire career, all of her life and research, to the practice of Christian hospitality. She's deeply shaped and formed how I think about hospitality and how we at Arise understand it. And I was once honored to share a meal in her house. And this was back when I was a seminary student in my 20s. And the one phrase I can really remember her talking about when she talked about hospitality was that it's not fussy. Now from the Deep South, that's a word that my friends and family use often. Fussy meaning pretentious, or like picking at the details, or needing things to be so-so or just right. And Christine Pohl, the scholar of hospitality, when she invites people to her own home, she said, I'm just showing you what I mean when I say it's a very simple table. And so it was set with super, super simple linens, super simple place settings, and it was more focused on the conversation in front of us. And I'll leave us with this today, Arise Church. There are 3 practices that I want to encourage us to take up as a community. 1 is to embrace a crappy, scruffy, not fussy hospitality. That means opening our doors to life as it really is, to our friends in Arise, to people who are newer in our community, to our neighbors, to our families, to our coworkers. Think about all the connections we can make across the city. Proposed practice number 2 is to expand our guest list. When we go to invite people to the table, let us consider who would otherwise be alone, who would be lonely, who would be hungry, who would be without, and let us really push and challenge ourselves to consider who we might be able to add to the table. And the 3rd is to focus on the quality of connection. When we're going to get together as a house church, around our own tables, at all gatherings, let's really think about what it looks like to really consider the other, to hold open space to ask really good questions, to get to know each other, to walk with one another, to do life together in a really meaningful way. So thanks for listening to all of this so far, Arise. Excited for the discussions that we're going to follow up with, and you will get them from your leader in the GroupMe.